Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
Welcome to week number 4 of the Building Your Best Self series, a 13-episode mini adventure to call forth your best self as you head into 2022. Now, today, you're going to be confronted with a pretty big question. Do you have the courage to turn pro? Turning pro is a concept introduced by Steven Pressfield, most well known as the author of The War of Art and The Legend of Bagger Vance. Turning pro is the not for the faint of heart decision to give up the life you have become extremely comfortable with, the predictable and safe life of the amateur, and instead to pursue the greatest version of who you are. Now, in our lingo, it's the decision to live your life 100% in pursuit of and in alignment with your great man, which is much more challenging and a much bigger commitment than it sounds on the surface. The decision to turn pro and to pursue your great man in all aspects of your life oftentimes requires a revolutionary change in how you live your life, which is why so few men do that. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about tangible real-world examples of the differences between how an amateur lives his life and how a pro lives his life. We're going to talk about what it means and what it takes to turn pro and why so few men have actually answered that call to step up into the greatest version, even though you know that part of you is calling you to rise above, why so few guys actually answer that call. We'll give you 5 characteristics of how the amateur behavior may be showing up in your life. And I certainly know I resonate with a number of these and still have that amateur behavior in certain areas of my life. 4 things about your life that change drastically when you choose to turn pro. Why pros have daily dedicated practices to maintain their professional status. And we're going to be giving you some of the most exceptional men in the world and what they do to perfect their craft through their daily practices. And then finally, why so many amateurs follow a shadow life, a diluted version of the life he really wants, to avoid the fear of what professional life will actually ask of him in terms of confronting his fears and making those changes in his life to pursue his best self. Enjoy this conversation today on building your best self and turning pro. Brian, man, we've had a chance to spend some pretty cool time together this week. You came up to New York City. We hit the world's largest sober dance party on Wednesday morning. We did a little daybreaker on the rooftop at the William Vale in Brooklyn, man. And I got a chance to see some of your moves. Remember your year of movement?
Yes.
That was an intention that you set. I would say you've definitely stepped into that.
When I got back home, Becca asked me, so how did it feel? Did you feel anxious the entire time? And I said half the time. Half the time, I felt like I was in my body and I was moving around. The other half, I was completely in my head. But I will say that whenever I went to those dance parties, especially the sober dance parties in the morning, I could feel a pull just to exit stage left like the entire time. Like, get out, stop, get out, go home. This is not normal. And I felt a little bit of that, but mostly I was enjoying like what was there. So it was a transition for sure.
50% improvement, man. That's good stuff. I'll take that. This podcast today is not just a 2-person show. Today we've got our secret weapon, our special brother who many of our listeners have reached out and said, we want more. We got the Gabagool, the Stugotz himself, the Brajol, Keith Bracci. Welcome back, dude.
Ooh, I had a cheer for myself. I don't know who else was going to cheer, so I throw it in there. This is Friday, man. I usually make my Fridays like Keith Day. I like to play a little golf or go to the gym or like just do something nice. And I can't think of a better way to spend a nice, beautiful Keith Day than with my 2 main men. So thanks for the invite.
Oof. That's good stuff, man. I was going to cheer for you. So next time you don't have to cheer for yourself.
Also, your cheer sounded a lot like an owl. It sounded a lot like hooting. But
no, it wasn't good.
Yeah,
I'll work on that.
Maybe there's a rooster. Yeah. Awesome to have you, brother.
Do you want to quickly explain to our listeners why I called you Gabagool and the Stugats? So you want to give our listeners who may not be Italian-American, who don't understand this lingo?
New York area, Brooklyn Italian. It's a pretty small window. Like there's so many, I don't know, quote unquote Italian words that we grew up thinking was like Italian, but now we discover it's just kind of, I don't know, Brooklynese, I guess, or New York, New Jersey-ese, but we always try to think of new ones. We got Gabagool, we got Stugats, Gagoots. What else?
Well, Stugats. So this is something like when Keith and I see each other, we yell it out in a crowded parking lot. We're like, yo, what's up, Stugats? And then we're like, what does that mean? Just in case, right? And we remember it came from The Sopranos. Tony Soprano's boat was named the Stugats. And so we're in the car together and I'm looking it up on Google. I'm like, what's the Stugats mean? It literally means the cock. It means the dick. So like we've been screaming out at each other in crowded parking lots, the dick. And anyone who knows that, like, can hear us screaming that out to each other. So just use these terms liberally, but also just know who's around.
It's a term of endearment, really.
Yeah, it's used with love.
So this is an awesome crew to have the conversation that we're going to have today. The three of us to have this conversation around turning pro. This is our fourth episode in a 13-part series around building your best self and building your best self for 2022. And we've covered some really important topics to date. This one feels like it may be the most important of all 13 because if we don't make the decision to turn pro in our lives, to step up into this great man, then I feel like everything else doesn't really matter. Like we can have all the time hacks in the world. We're talking about managing energy. You can ask yourself big questions. But if you don't make this big decision to move into the highest level of who you are, then I don't think you're ever going to be playing at the level that you aspire to. So let's just set the context here, and then I'll come to you guys for your reactions. Turning pro is a term that is borrowed from a book by Steven Pressfield. The book is called Turning Pro. Steven Pressfield's a name you may be familiar with because his most popular work is a book called The War of Art. And The War of Art has a very simple and profound concept. We have two lives, the life we currently live and the unlived life within us. And in between those two stands resistance, right? Which is fear. In the great man within realm, the way that we translate that is you have the life you currently live and the unlived life of that great man within you, the fullest potential version of yourself. Right. And the resistance that stands in between the two, we talk about as drift, right? Just unconsciously living through life with your habits and patterns and unconscious belief systems, a lack of intentionality. And then if you live that life long enough, you'll end up living out the definition of hell, where at the end of your life, the man that you became meets the man you could have become. This book, Turning Pro, is a continuation of that concept of how do you step out of that unlived life, out of the life you're living into the unlived life. And the decision to turn pro is the decision of stepping into your great man. And in the book, the way that Steven Pressfield talks about it is he looks at his life defined into two segments. The period of his life where he was an amateur and the period of his life where he decided to turn pro. And I'm going to read this passage from, it's basically page 5 of the book that sets this up. And then I'll come to you guys for your reactions. This book proposes a model of the amateur and the professional. The thesis of this book is that what ails you and me has nothing to do with being sick or being wrong. What ails us is that we are living our lives as amateurs. The solution this book suggests is that we turn pro. Turning pro is free, but it's not easy. You don't need to take a course or buy a product. All you have to do is change your mind. Turning pro is free, but it's not without cost. When we turn pro, we give up a life with which we may have become extremely comfortable. We give up a self that we have come to identify with and to call our own. We may have to give up friends, lovers, even spouses. Turning pro is free, but it demands sacrifice. The passage is often accompanied by an interior odyssey whose trials are survived only at great cost, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. We pass through a membrane when we turn pro. It hurts. It's messy and it's scary. We tread in blood when we turn pro. Turning pro is not for everyone. We have to be a little crazy to do it, or even to want to do it. In many ways, the passage chooses us. We don't choose it. We simply have no alternative. What we get when we turn pro is we find our power. We find our will and our voice, and we find our self-respect. We become who we always were, but had until then been afraid to embrace and to live out. What's coming up for you guys as you hear that incredibly potent passage?
I didn't read the book, so I have so many questions. I want to know more about what is turning pro? What does that even mean? I have my own assumptions. I'm trying to sit here in my head wait, where am I pro in my life? Where am I amateur and all that? I can't wait to hear about how you draw that line.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's funny, Dom. He brings up two concepts in that intro. One about being comfortable and just having to give up the identity, but also something where turning pro chooses you. And I see those two things as a bit opposite. When you read a paragraph like that, it's so distinct. It's so clear. It's also, what does it mean, right, Keith? You've got a lot of questions about it. And what I noticed as I went through this book is that when you read the words like that, how clear and theoretical it is, but in life, how subtle, how these things about being amateur, we don't even fully know or understand. And one thing he says, I think pretty quickly thereafter, he says, we only know that something is wrong, but we don't know how to fix it. We feel restless. We feel bored. We feel angry. We feel shame. But oftentimes we squelch that. We find the booze. We find the distraction. And we start to live this other comfortable life. So I actually don't fully subscribe to the it chooses you. I think it is a choice that we have to make, but I understand the concept there.
I'll weigh in on that because I do see both sides of it choosing us and then we also having to choose to go along with it because I think it's a little bit of getting hit by the Mack truck and then also getting up from the Mack truck and changing your behaviors. And we see a lot of people get hit by the Mack truck and then just get back up, pick up their guts and do the same thing they've always been doing. So to make this specific, I think that every man who's listening to this podcast can relate to the idea of knowing the level that you're playing at right now and also knowing that there's a new level that's calling you, right? That next level is calling you. And sometimes you know what that next level is very clearly, right? I need to get that promotion at work. I need to find the partner of my dreams. I need to get my mental health in order, my physical health in order. Sometimes it's very clear. Sometimes it's a lot more nebulous than that. And it could just feel like, God, I got everything on paper, that I'm supposed to have. I should be grateful, but I'm not. I feel like there's something more in the tank that I should be going after, and I can't quite put my finger on what that next level is. Oftentimes, like you said, Brian, we bury that with distractions, maybe workaholism or just numbing out, whatever our coping mechanisms are. What Stephen Pressfield is talking about is when we don't answer that call that's coming in from the next level, we are choosing to remain as amateurs. And remaining as an amateur for maybe a short period of time, you can feel a little bit placated because, like he says, going for that next level requires discomfort. It requires some wholesale changes. It requires an internal odyssey. Being incapacitated in a state of amateur allows you to avoid all that, and that's comfortable in the short term. In the long term, that crushes your soul. And so I thought what I would share with you guys, again, to make this even more tangible and, jump in on any of these that you really want to jump in, that really want to stick your teeth into. He gives a number of characteristics of what it is to live life as an amateur. And I called down 5 of them. Let me hit the first one. I'll pause after this first one because I know that you guys got something to say about this one. The number one characteristic, or the first one he lists of an amateur, is the amateur is terrified, right? The amateur lives in fear. Fear is what drives the amateur's behaviors. And he says that the ultimate fear of the amateur that's terrified is being kicked out of the tribe. And so, Bri, I know you have a very specific, like, you're kind of like, okay, I get that being kicked out of the tribe. I get that conceptually, but you had to make it more tangible. What was your example of that?
We've heard this in other books too, right? We've heard this in Sapiens. We've heard this in several other books that we've talked about. But this fear, this natural fear that we have as humans, that we are a community species, and being kicked out of that community can mean death and has meant death in the past. And so we are wired, our brains are wired to be part of that community. So if we're doing something to be different, to other ourselves, to turn pro, that can be a really scary thing. But then I look at my life and I was like, well, what tribe am I worried about? Am I worried about my family kicking me out of the family? I don't know. Like, that seems a little bit off. Am I worried about my friends not accepting me anymore? Am I worried about my partner leaving me? Like who is this tribe? And like, how is it potentially affecting me if I'm afraid of being kicked out? And in 2016, I started my first business. It was a sexual health business. In my family growing up, we did not talk about sex or even sexual health. And so when I started talking publicly about sex and sexual health, there was backlash in my family and of my friends. I got questioned like, why do you have to talk about this stuff? Like, can't you just run your business and like not be talking about masturbation and sex and health and related to sex? Like, why do you got to do that? You know, my parents were really upset that I was talking about this stuff publicly. And so that felt like the ultimate form of rejection. Now, they didn't say I couldn't go to their house. They didn't not call me anymore, but the relationship felt different. And that still sits with me today when I think about turning pro, when I think about defining myself and who I am and what I'm going to bring to the world. And quite honestly, it's really held me back from like doing something different again. So this one really resonated with me once I was able to take it down to the my story of it.
Boom. Keith, what's coming up for you?
Yeah, I'm feeling into that, like, kicked out of the tribe. And similar to Brian, like, I don't see where, like, no matter what happens, where you guys aren't going to still be my buddies. Like, my family is not going to be like, Keith, you're gone because you failed at this. But I do sense that, like, you know, if my business, for example, which is probably one of my bigger fears of my business collapsing, right? If that collapsed, I'm feeling into like potential, like, not reality, because again, I'm not getting kicked out of any tribe, but feeling devalued, you know, feeling less valued. And then maybe that primal instinct of like, I need to have a high value, to have a high status, to stay in my tribe, to then not be outcast and die. Like, that isn't a reality, but it still feels like it could be something, you know, that comes up and drives why I'm so scared to lose what I have. Because the reality is, I mean, if I lose my business, I'll go get another job. My kids are still eating. We still have a roof. Like, there is no reality where I'm homeless. You know, I'll come sleep on your couch, Tom. I'm sure you'd be happy to have us. So what is actually at stake? And it does feel like some kind of devaluing and no longer being accepted in some kind of way.
The kicking out of tribe from like the prehistoric days, which meant death, is very different than the getting kicked out of a tribe today. It's much more emotionally based, right? Emotionally and socially based. So for example, you know, Porngate, for me, I decided to turn pro and speak openly about all things sexual health. And me talking about that ended up getting me kicked out of the industry that paid 90 to 95% of my bills, right? So I didn't die, but my business did. And, you know, a lot of the people who I associated with and a lot of the people who were my biggest champions are no longer, right? So that's gone. Rewind tape 5 or 6 years ago when I was back in corporate and before I, you know, decided to move into this entrepreneurial realm, when I started posting video blogs and, you know, blogs talking about intentionality and, you know, breaking free from drift and managing your time, I had a lot of people who made fun of me for trying to step up into this. Now I'm a thought leader. I'm someone who's teaching. And they're like, dude, like, who the hell do you think you are? Right? They still saw me as an amateur. So to step up and share of yourself and to become a magnet potentially for criticism, that's the emotional ostracism from the tribe that most of us fear, right? We're not dying, but a part of the relationship is forever changing. And that's the fear. The other part of this, Bri, is, you know, before we started hitting record, you were like, I kind of get envious of listening to musical artists, right? Who sing about sex, who sing about love. And everyone praises them. But as soon as I start talking about it, I get made fun of, or people, call me back in, or like the crabs in the bucket trying to pull me back down. And I think you had a pretty powerful insight about why that may happen. And so I wanted you to share that with our audience too.
Yeah, there seems to be a chasm between being amateur and then being seen as pro. Some of the same people that was giving me a hard time about talking about sex and sexual health are the same people listening to Cardi B, right? And like seeing those lyrics, like no problem whatsoever. And like, of course, they're a celebrity. They can talk about these sort of things. And I'm like, wait a second, you just told me I couldn't talk about those things. And so what's up, right? Like, why can't I talk about these things? Something that we talk about in HR is defining and describing our puzzle piece, like us as like what our skill sets are, what our personalities are. Because when we do that, people know what to do with us. They're like, oh, I know where this puzzle piece fits into the puzzle. I can place you in this position, right? And that's part of the tribe. Part of the tribe knows what to do with you. What we're talking about when we say go pro, we're actually redefining on purpose, right, what that puzzle piece is. And there's a time period in which people don't know what to do with you.
Right.
And that is the kicking out, the misunderstanding. And especially when they've seen the other puzzle piece, they assume that you're still that puzzle piece, but you're in transition. You're in that change. So that chasm between amateur and pro, and Pressfield describes this really well in that paragraph that you read. It can be bloody. It can be really, really messy.
Oh, I couldn't think of a better description than what you just gave about people are looking to simplify you into a puzzle piece. And when your puzzle piece changes, they don't know what to do with you. And so if you choose to go pro, people are going to be relating to you as an amateur for the indefinite future, and it's going to suck. A lot of the men in our masterminds are going through transitions, and like their relationships with their friends or people, family members are starting to fracture because they're going for pro. But a lot of their family members, a lot of their friends, a lot of their business associates are still staying as amateurs, and they don't want that person to turn pro, or they don't know what that means. That chasm that you described, Bri, I want to put some texture around that because that's an incredibly important point. When you're at the level you're at right now, a lot of the personal development game is really just a series of incremental 1% gains, right? Like you show up every day, you do your thing, you get better, you go to the gym, you work out, you do your mental health, maybe you meditate, you work on your business, you work on your relationship, 1%, 1%, 1%, 1%. That's how you grow inside of that existing level. But then you reach the ceiling of that particular level, right? And you almost think about it like a video game, like when you end up at the end of that level, you have to face the boss. And that boss, like you can't beat with like these 1% incremental improvements. Like there's a chasm between that and that next level that requires maybe a 20% jump, a 50% jump. And that requires a lot of discomfort, a lot of fear, a lot of mess. And so most people don't realize that 1% no longer suffices. Like you have to rip some Band-Aids to go to that turning pro level. And that's why a lot of us get stuck current level we're at. So let me maybe just hit these other amateur characteristics and see if you guys want to dive in on any of these. By the way, the other thing that Stephen Pressfield says about, the amateur is terrified, he says the professional is also terrified. The amateur stays incapacitated in that terror. The professional chooses to take action in the face of that terror.
And one thing I want to hit here, Dom, is that incapacitation, right? So fear paralyzes us, but it's not that we don't do anything, right? It's not that so we just sit there and we're like, oh my God, I'm afraid I'm not going to do anything, right? We still do these activities, but they're deflections or distractions of like what that ultimate purpose is, like what that pro version of us would be doing. So, and he talks about this as a shadow career or shadow activities. And it could be as simple. I mean, we love to use the example of like, I'm feeling upset. I'm feeling jealousy. Let me go grab a beer, right? Just because it's such a simple numbing effect. So it's not that we're not doing anything once we feel fear. It's just that we're not doing the things. We're distracted from the things that will give us that energy to go pro.
Right on.
Yeah. And I love like even just the thought of like bravery and courage, these things where you're like showing up strong. It's not that you don't feel scared, you're still scared, but you just show up to that fear with action and not being like stuck and paralyzed.
Yeah. Dan Sullivan, who runs Strategic Coach, says, fear is wetting your pants. Courage is doing what needs to get done with wet pants.
Love it. So good.
The other characteristics of amateur. Number 2, the amateur lives by the opinions of others, right? The other people, their criticisms, what they think you should do, like defines what the amateur does. Number 3, the amateur is easily distracted, right? Going from one thing to the other. And I think he says something along the lines of, resistance hates concentration and depth, like going deep, doing deep work, right? And the amateur loves moving from one thing to the other. The amateur is much more seduced by novelty than they are by mastery. Number 4, the amateur seeks immediate gratification. I want the payoff now. I want the win now. If I don't get that thing now, then I'll give up on it because I can't stick for the long haul. And the amateur is jealous. Right? I see someone else going after their dream. I see someone else succeeding that I know I'm smarter than or I'm better than, so I'm going to cut that person down. And the bonus one here, this is the other one I wrote down, is the amateur has a million plans and they all start tomorrow.
Yeah, it's great. Like that last one and also like the distraction one, I can really feel that in me when there's hard stuff that I need to do. My mind wants to go to distraction, wants to just pick up the phone and scroll on social media, something easy. Like I don't want to go do that really hard thing. And it's not a conscious thought. It's like, it's oftentimes unconscious. And so I've kind of set these things up. I know what my distractions are, and I've set them up in a way where I have to kind of walk over a little hurdle to get to them. And that little hurdle makes me pause and be aware. Wait, why am I going to do this? Why am I going to go jerk off? Am I horny? Right. Or I want to distract myself? Why am I going to Reddit to scroll through? Is it because I just have some space, or is there something that needs my attention right now that's making me so uncomfortable that I'm going to do anything to get away from it? And like really feeling into those kinds of things. And then you go, shit, once you become aware of it, it's like, all right, now I can't just distract. I got to go do that thing, once you become aware. But it's real easy to just stay in that drift and not pay attention.
Keith, what else is in that bucket? So you mentioned jerking off, you mentioned Reddit, and those are like two like easy things to point at. But there's other things that are like kind of productive, that you're kind of moving the ball forward. Do you have activities in that bucket?
Yeah, I clean my desk, you know what I mean? Or something that like, that's productive, right? Like I'll just start refiling something that has to get done. It's
so easy to justify, right? I'm going to recondos and clean your space. And that's going to make me more clear so I can do stuff. So I better do it, right?
Right. But the thing that really needs to be done right now is to make that hard phone call that I just don't want to do,
Right. One thing that Pressfield says in the book is that life goes down the tubes one repetition at a time, one deflection at a time, and he said 140 characters at a time, right? And so like that, it's like each one of those, you cleaning your desk one time isn't going to be a big deal. And quite frankly, maybe it needs to be cleaned. Is that your desk behind you? You guys are still moving in. You're safe. It's okay.
Yeah, cut me some slack.
But yeah, it's one at a time. So it's not the one that hurts. It's like the death by a million paper cuts.
I'll give you guys a real personal example around this. So I made the decision to go pro a while ago, but there's parts of my life, right? Like segments of my life where I haven't fully gone pro. And we'll talk about kind of how to think about that in a minute. But to get specific, when it comes to this area of love and romance, I want to find my partner, right? I want to find, I call her my queen. I want to find the queen that I can build a future with, a family with. And I've done a lot to get myself ready for that. But over the past couple of weeks, I noticed some real amateur behavior that falls into the easily distracted, seeks immediate gratification. So I'm not sexually active right now. I'm not dating anybody right now. But I find that there are these women in my life that I do have like the ability to exchange sexual messages with. I've got 4 or 5 different women in my life who I'm not sexually active with, but if I cobble them together, I almost get all my emotional needs of a relationship met, if that makes sense. Like, one of them is like really beautiful and I love to be seen out in town with her and, like working out and going to meals with her. So I get that feeling and she's fun and she's exciting. And then someone else I go to for emotional gratification. Someone else I go to for sexual gratification. And I look at how much of my time and my energy is consumed with them versus keeping the space open and dealing with the discomfort of not having my queen right now. Keith, you talked about that. Like, when you say, when I go to jerk off, is it because I really want to and I'm horny or because I'm avoiding something? What I found was that those behaviors and the way that like I've navigated those micro decisions with those women is because there is something deeply uncomfortable for me about not having someone. And I've really had to grapple with that. And so the other day in my journal, I decided that I'm going to go pro with this respect to like love and intimacy. And when I feel that urge to grab from my phone and text one of them for some emotional support or, you know, emotional neediness really, or sexting, that I'm just going to actually feel that and let that urge and that desire and that pain to come up and to be with it and to let it go. And it's fucking sucked, guys. Like it sucks. It sucks. And it's a release. And I'm finding that the cravings, those urges are starting to dissolve and to dissipate, and they're coming up and they're passing much more quickly.
Yeah, going pro will take some time, but the individual actions, like what you just did, can be immediate. And the feel of what happens to our energy when we make those decisions is immediate. It takes a while to build up. It takes a while to go pro, but we can feel it. We can feel it right away.
I love what you did there, just sitting in that discomfort. That's where you learn about yourself. That's where self-awareness comes into play. That's where you can no longer be a victim of that stuff, and you can actually understand why this stuff is coming up and then redirect it, and it doesn't come up that way again. But without pausing in that moment to really harness that gold that's right there for you to learn about yourself, which is what we're all here for. I mean, what the hell else are we doing? You know, what's a better topic to learn about? It's those moments where it's right there on the surface. And if you just kind of push it away, you're throwing the textbook into the garbage.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that, man. It's been challenging, but it's been rewarding. I think that also is a nice segue to this conversation about how turning pro is a decision and it's also a series of decisions. You know, I look at turning pro as there's this macro level decision to turn pro and to go after your great man and to pursue like the ultimate version of who you are. There's also a series of other subsidiary discussions around turning pro, around these like specific areas of your life, you know, like physical well-being, mental well-being, sex and love, like these kinds of things. And if you think about it from a business perspective, like going after your great man is kind of like the parent company, right? The CEO, the chairman of the board decides that this business is now going to strive for greatness. And the entire ecosystem of our businesses are eventually going to align with becoming the great man. Then you have all those business subsidiaries, you know, love, finances, career, purpose, physical well-being. Those all require individual turning pro decisions. Like to get very clear on that, because for me, it was interesting. I didn't make the parent company level decision first. I made a subsidiary level decision first. Back in 2010, I decided to turn pro in my personal development life. You know, like I recognized that when I hit my financial pinnacle at age 30, I had a great year and I felt unfulfilled. I was like, shit, there's got to be something else out there. And so when I turned to personal development, I was like, I'm going to learn as much about what lights me up as possible. And I started reading like, you know, Tim Ferriss and David Deida, went to Landmark Forum, learned NLP and hypnosis. I was on this like 4-year odyssey of doing inner work. And I turned pro in that subsidiary of my life, but it was only after entering Sex Addicts Anonymous in 2013 and coming crashing down and having one of these epiphanies that Stephen Pressfield talks about in Turning Pro, which are usually this paradox of getting raked over the coals and getting hit by the Mack truck, stripped of your self-delusion is what he calls it. So you see yourself naked. Those epiphanies are usually like an ugly but beautiful moment. That was when, on the heels of that in 2014, when I finally decided, February 2014, where I said, I'm going to turn pro and go after my great man. And I'm going to leave the corporate world. I'm going to become an entrepreneur. I'm going to chart a course the rest of my life to figure out what is my purpose, what is my meaning. And so at the parent company level, it took me 4 years to get there after making it at one of the subsidiary levels.
And Dom, I know that to go pro, there's some decisions that have to be made, right, at the CEO level, at the parent company level, that includes some structures. And like, hey, subsidiaries, this is how we're all going to work together and how we're going to act. I know he talks about this a bit in the book around practices. So maybe we can spend a few minutes here talking about like what this really important piece of practices and habits.
Awesome. So I think one of the things that leads into this conversation about practice, he goes, he has a number of things that says, what changes when we turn pro? And I wrote down 4 of the things that he said changes. Number 1, we stop fleeing. We stop fleeing from our fears and instead we face them. Instead of distracting ourselves, instead of numbing ourselves out, we turn and face to those fears. And the fear, like we still feel it, but the amateur runs away from it. We get incapacitated by it, paralyzed by it. The pro faces them. Number 2, when we turn pro, it changes how we spend our days completely. We wake up differently. We go to bed differently, right? We eat our food differently. We work out differently. The media we consume is different. All of that starts to change when we turn pro. Number 3, it changes how we spend our time. We actually look and get a lot more intentional around how we spend our time. And 4th, turning pro changes who we spend our time with, right? So we all know, the 3 of us, as we've turned pro in different areas of our lives, that certain relationships that we spent a lot of our times with have changed. And who we spend our time with now is very different than who we spent our time with 5, 10 years ago. So, those are the big arenas. And then he kind of puts a bow on that by saying pros have practices. And I talk a lot about this in my book On Purpose Leadership, right? Practices are the foundation on a daily basis of how you live out your purpose. So what is a practice? This is how he defines it. A practice is to follow a rigorous, prescribed regimen with the intention of elevating the mind and the spirit to a higher level. A practice is intended to produce a communion with a power greater than yourself. So here's 2 very practical examples of that. Stephen King, right? One of the most prolific writers of our time, 50, 60 books, all time, all of them are bestsellers. Stephen King's practice, it's devotional. 6 a.m. every morning. He's in front of his computer, typing until 2 p.m. Every day, without fail, whether he wants to be there or not, 8 hours, he's typing. Whether or not he puts out 1,000 words, 15,000 words in those 8 hours, he's there every single day typing. Because he says, when I show up, the muse, right, the creative knows where I'm going to be every single day and then will show up and provide me inspiration. Dennis Rodman, the greatest rebounder in NBA history, after hours of practice was over and everyone else had cleared the gym, he would go in for another hour and a half and 2 hours and have someone shoot baskets where he would rebound on, another 500 or 1,000 rebounds so that he could learn how a ball bounced off the backboard, off a rim, if it was a high shot, if it was a low shot, if it was a shot that had spin, which way it would come off the backboard, so he could learn how to position himself and be in the greatest position to grab the board, because during game time, he had that much more information than anyone. That was his devotional practice. And when I look at my life, the single biggest leverage point for all change has been my devotional morning practice. It started 6 or 7 years ago with just a few minutes in the morning around meditation, maybe some breath work, some reading. And over the course of time, it has evolved and changed, and it's become a lot longer now because my morning routine, every day when I show up, I know I'm going to anchor and center into myself. I know that I'm going to be listening to a power greater than me that can guide me through some of the difficult decisions I have in my life. I've broken compulsions. I've radically changed my business. I've made decisions about my love life, because every morning I show up for myself in that space. Yeah. What's coming up for you guys as you hear all about that?
There's a section in the book and it's called His Year of Turning Pro. And he documents what his life was like in that year of turning pro. And it was largely, he quarantined himself. He wasn't doing a lot of external things. He was facing the demons and everything else. But there was a question that kept coming up for him, which was, what happens when my life gets more complicated? Can I still do these things? Can I still quarantine myself? Can I still have these practices, right? That's really what he was doing, is he was building practices. And the next sentence in the book, he says, and that didn't matter. Because by the time I got to the place of more complex life, I had already turned pro. I had built these structures in my life to do these sort of things. So when I hear stories about Dennis Rodman after hours of basketball practice staying and capturing rebounds, when I hear writing words from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., that all sounds like a lot. It sounds like where in the world would I find time to do something like that? But Dominic, I appreciate your story because what you started with is just some curiosity around like, what should the morning look like for me? You explored what are those activities, and then you designed what it is. And now, how long is your morning practice now? Your devotional practice?
Certain days, it's 3 to 4 hours.
Right.
Today, it was literally like I was up at 5 o'clock, and in those 4 hours, I ended up reading, I ended up meditating, I ended up journaling, I ended up working out, I ended up creating. 5 things in those 4 hours that, because my life is so aligned right now, it's not solely work because it does feed into my work. And it's not solely play because my play also feeds into my work. So by 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm in an optimal state so that when we get on this call, when we're recording, all those 4 hours have fed into this. So hopefully like we're producing something that's beautiful for our listeners. But those 4 hours, which I'm sure sounds completely overwhelming to anyone who's listening, started with 5 to 10 minutes. And those 5 to 10 minutes, 6 or 7 years ago, was just a commitment to not look at my phone first thing in the morning, to do maybe 5 minutes of meditation and maybe 5 minutes of reading something that like would set me up in a better place than the news would, 5 minutes of like a personal development book. When I felt the benefit of that, it turned into 15 minutes. And then I grew it to 20 minutes. Then it became an hour. And then those things started to change what I said yes to over the course of the day. And then it started to change my business strategy. I started changing the rest of my life based on how the morning was informing what I wanted my life to look like.
I think that's one of the big things is you weren't taking the external things of life and saying, how do I service these external things? You were saying, let me change what's happening here and my life will change around it. And that's a big difference, right? The first is an amateur move. Where it's like, what are these things? How do I service them? I know that because I often do that. Like, when do I have to have this meeting? When do I have to do this thing? Like, I can't do my meditation this morning because of XYZ, right? And then I'll go into a period where I don't have those meetings. I'm like, oh, I have time for my morning practice now. I'll go ahead and do my meditation. I mentioned earlier before we hit record, I often think about practices like this, like a meditation, like going to the gym. And I wish there was a degree like where I can like just do it enough times and then get the certificate, put it on my wall, be like, now I'm done with working out. Now I'm done with meditating. But like, it doesn't work like that. It's an amateur freaking move, right? The pro move here, which was what you talked about, is like, hey, these are the things working for me. I'm seeing the results of them. Let me see how I change the world around me to fit that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys think. I feel like there's got to be some kind of guiding light, some kind of purpose, right? Defined where, like Stephen King, if he's just trying to survive, he doesn't have to write every day. He's already got money and he's good, But if he's trying to be the most prolific writer of all time, or he's trying to push the boundaries of what writing is capable of, or whatever's driving him, if you have that as your guiding light, then I need to sit down and type for 8 hours every single day. So I'm looking at it for me, like if I'm just trying to exist, I'm already doing what I need to do to exist. But if I want to level up, what does that look like? Where am I going and why? And then once I have that, all right, how do I got to get there? Okay, now I got to build some structure and it's going to change the way I've been doing it. So I would get somewhere different than I am right now.
Something he talks about in this book is that he wanted to be a great writer, right? Like he always had this thing in him. He didn't go into detail of like where that came from. But it was an assumption going into the book that he wanted to be a great writer. It doesn't hurt that his last name is Pressfield and he wanted to be a great writer. Like there's some pretty clear indicators here of like what his big purpose was. And Dominic, in your story, you mentioned, I started doing personal development. I went to Landmark. I started experimenting with hypnosis, right? And all this stuff felt like really energetic and really aligned. But Keith, you're right. Without that, like, this is what I want, then like, what are the structures that we even need in place?
The very easy answer to that. It's following your greatest energy. This is the episode that we did 2 episodes ago, Brian. Anyone who hasn't listened to that episode needs to listen to that episode. So most of us will not know what our purpose is or what that guiding light is. Like, and I think that stymies a lot of us from taking action because there's a lot of pressure in that, figuring out like, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? What is my calling? And I didn't have my calling back in 2010. I just knew that there was something inherently energizing about reading The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, and just like having my mind blown around how I structure my life, what like he was offering as a new way of living. and then going to the Landmark Forum and learning about my stories and my rackets and my strong suits, all these things. I'm like, oh my God, like give me more. I want to sink my teeth into that. I was energized, my greatest energy. I just followed it. I just followed that. And then ultimately it ends up informing, like what that next level is. One last segue into the thing that another concept here that I think is really important from the book that we hit on before we wrap is this idea of, and Brian, you brought this up earlier, our shadow careers, the shadow work that we do, shadow callings, the shadow life. What Stephen Pressfield says is amateurs often move into these careers and these lives that align, they kind of run parallel to the pro track, but don't ask a lot of us in terms of risk. Like we don't have to fully commit to going after the great man life. And his example of that was, he wanted to write, he wanted to be a writer because writing for him was like a life of adventure. Instead of that, he became like a long haul trucker. Long haul trucking allowed him to live a life of adventure, see the country, mix it up with really interesting people, be on the road, never be in one place. And that allowed him to get a taste while at the same time avoiding all of the fear of like writing a book that would fail or criticism or, feeling like shit that he wasn't producing anything he loved. He talks about this, like, the actors who never really become actors, they just become a stagehand and hang around the plays, hang around the productions. Person who becomes a coach because they're not, they're afraid to become a player. Brad Barrett is a guy that's a great friend to the podcast. He runs the Choose FI podcast. Brad Barrett was a CPA, a certified public accountant, before he learned that his greatest energy was teaching other people how to save. And he followed his greatest energy of, I'm going to write an article on how to teach people how to go to Disney World for free. Take a family of 4. That went viral on the New York Times. And then he was like, well, I'm going to start a podcast. He followed his greatest energy. And then he realized my shadow career is being a CPA and helping other people move their money around and learning how to finance businesses. Instead, I'm going to teach other people. And he stepped into turning pro. That's how this stuff works.
And if somebody's listening to this podcast right now and they're like, Dominic, I don't know what the hell the greatest energy is. I don't know if I've ever felt the greatest energy. That's cool, right? Pressfield actually gives some indicators for another place to look. And that's these emotions of restlessness, of boredom, of anger, of shame. And this is why we talk about emotions being so important, because usually we'll just numb those out. But here's what I can promise you. If you go deep, right, which is a pro move. He talks about this in the book. Going deep is a pro move. If you go deep on those emotions when you feel them and you start asking questions like, I wonder why it's there. Or like, this is real. Let me give me 5 minutes to think about why it might be here. I can promise you those are the clues to your greatest energy. The greatest energy leads to purpose, like a Stephen King writing, a prolific writer, or anything else. And so it's not that far away. And as Dominic said, it's not the life purpose. It's not the only thing I ever have to do. It's the thing right now, which is giving us our greatest energy.
If this conversation about turning pro lit a fire under your ass to pursue that next level of your life that you've been wanting to but have been holding back, or to go after your great man in totality, then you are not going to want to miss the masterclass that I'm running on building your best self for 2022. And that's happening on Wednesday, November 17th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. In the show notes, I have an email address with all the instructions on how to get your name on the wait list. We are in the process of building out an Eventbrite so that you can register for that event. We're about 2 or 3 weeks away from getting that set up. But that is going to be a killer conversation that builds on the turning pro conversation we had today, the greatest energy conversation we had a few weeks ago, how to manage your time. All of these podcast episodes are building to have that one conversation around how can you start to build this version of you, that next level, to break through that ceiling, right? That chasm that Brian talked about, to go to the next level that's calling. So in the show notes, if you're interested, send an email to hello@DominicQ. You'll see all the instructions below. And I hope to see you on Wednesday, November 17th.